Singapore aims to produce 30% of its nutritional needs locally by 2030. But reaching that target will require investment in small, sustainable food businesses ready to scale. To talk about this, we have Gareth Lloyd from Truly Nuts and Charles Wong from TNB Aura. So, what do investors really look for when a small, sustainable brand wants to grow?
I think investors are still looking for many of the same things that they've always looked for. They want a replicable model that can scale, but they are now starting to really dial into making sure that those brands are sustainable. They understand what consumers want now, and a recent study I read said 73% of consumers would change their buying habits just to reduce their impact on the environment, and investors are dialing into that massively. Authenticity is obviously critical because so many businesses I think out there are involved in kind of greenwashing, and I think that's why at Truly Nuts, for example, we source Brazil nuts ethically by hand from the Amazon rainforest. This prevents deforestation. We have a lot of video and content in our sites to show exactly what we're doing there, and we invest 25% of our profits back into the jungle and back into environmental and community projects to give back. So that integrity builds trust with investors and consumers alike.
We are a Series A focused venture capital fund focused on Southeast Asia as a region, making investments across Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and of course markets like Singapore and the rest of the region. What do we look for as a venture capital investor when looking at small, high-growth emerging brands? So let me take a quick step back and first look at the 2030 target. The brands that we look for can't just be ones that swell with the rising tide of the government support, but ones that really stand on their own feet. So to us, there are three primary identifications that we look for. One is clear brand signaling value. Two is pervasive unit economics and business model advantage. And three, the decision and the thoughtful decision between owning one's own distribution or relying on partners.
How much ownership would you say should a founder give up to scale sustainably?
It's a very good question. And I don't believe there is a sort of magic number that founders should look to. I think what is the number you need to share as a founder in order to scale and hit your vision? And that's how I would look at it. Over the years with various businesses, I've always looked at every partnership, whether it's business partners, equity partners, partners for sales. Are they aligned with the vision of where we're heading? Can they get us there faster? Or can we get something bigger by partnering with them? So I think it really, really does depend on what the partner's bringing and what you're going to get with that investment of equity. And then as long as they're aligned to the vision and the values of the company, and it benefits both parties, I think there's flexibility on that number.
General rule of thumb is that the seed stage, so this is a little bit earlier than where we typically invest, founders are usually giving roughly around 10 to 20% of equity up early on to earlier investors such as angels, pre-seed, and seed funds. The objective there for the seed funds is to help those seed stage companies then achieve Series A. Series A is where the companies typically do 1 million or more in terms of annualized revenue. And when they raise capital, it's going to be somewhat larger, i.e. now they're getting to that point where they've got some level of product market fit. And in order to raise the capital sufficient, which is typically anywhere between the order of magnitude of $3, $5, even $10 million, the equity dilution is typically 20 to 25%. And again, it's not just about the money. It's about what can the venture capitalists, the investors, do to help that business scale. At later stages, when you get to Series B, Series C, and as the journey continues into growth, the percentages given up do vary quite significantly. Typically, around 10 to 15% is a good rule of thumb. So Series A is what we see as that inflection point where a company's gone from being very early to being a little bit at the growth stage.
On that note, there are also concerns on losing brand identity due to this. So if you were to give our viewers some advice, how do you preserve brand identity while chasing growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. The biggest thing for us has always been to focus on your purpose, your mission, and focus on the values. I think so many companies that scale fast. At times, I've done it myself. I've made those mistakes myself. You forget or lose sight of some of the core values and the core purpose to the business, and then the culture can be derailed. The brand can lose its identity. So staying super true to those values and making sure that you're aligned on the vision and working towards that every day will make sure that you preserve that brand identity, even when you're tracing significant growth.
Fundamentally, I use this term as authenticity. I think it's incredibly important as a brand business to be authentic about who oneself is. So authenticity comes from clearly documenting, communicating, and living and breathing said core values. So let me go back to what we look for as an organization when we think about this brand signaling value. Why is F&B, as an example, so hard? It's because rather than a winner-take-all market, people crave that variety. So the idea to be authentic when talking about one's core values, and whether you express it to your team, whether you express it to your market, having this singular purpose behind it gives you the ability to have one voice. And I think that's number one when you think about preserving brand identity. Number two is consistency across various platforms, especially if we're talking about food businesses, agriculture type businesses, when there are a lot of different supply chain channels that one can go through. Chasing growth through one direction, so for example, through retailers and distribution versus your own brand, may look like a really great idea very early on. But if you aren't able to preserve that brand identity and the authenticity of one's brand, chasing growth can be for naught. Because let's say eventually you're relying on marketplaces, you're relying on lots of other distributors to get to that growth. And if you don't have that brand identity, once those marketplaces, maybe they switch to a different brand, or perhaps when the customers realize you're not being authentic, when they move from your brand.com business to those marketplaces, you'll lose those customers. You'll lose that ability to have the retention that's so important for businesses like this. And finally, the third one that I'd highlight here in terms of continuing this authenticity is being authentic with your shareholders and your stakeholders. So authenticity about what can your business actually achieve? Are you actually able to generate 100 times return type profile for your investors, or are you just selling the story? Being authentic about that, and especially when you're dealing with brand businesses, it's not always that straightforward. If you look at some businesses around the world, they have a business model tendency to be able to achieve this kind of exponential growth, whereas others where you're looking at building new, for example, locations, F&B outlets, new sites, new production facilities, they take a slightly more step change degree of growth. And it's not that ventures is for everyone. In fact, in many cases, if you are authentic to your own purpose, I want to be the biggest brand in Southeast Asia, for example, the biggest brand in a particular category, for example, halal food or whatever it might be, having that authenticity to talk to investors allows the investors to self-select you, and you self-select the investors. And by doing so, having hopefully a much more sustainable growth in the long term.
Thank you so much for your time today, Gareth and Charles. Looking forward to having you both back on the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Seth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Once again, those were Gareth Lloyd, co-founder and chief executive officer of Truly Nuts, and Charles Wong, co-founder and managing partner at TNB Aura. For more news, visit sbr.com.sg.